Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
But we begin, as I think we must, with politics and big picture stuff. I felt, I don't know about you, but I felt we stumbled yesterday into really fertile territory. And I don't know quite what happened, because at 2 minutes to 10, I was sitting here fully prepared to regale you with yet another recounting of Boris Johnson's long list of personal, political, professional and moral transgressions. And I didn't. I don't know why. I just sort of came on air and didn't feel the blood rising, felt instead that this was a moment for contemplation, consideration and cogitation, as Johnson himself might say, with his fondness for rhetorical flourishes, alliteration and slightly recondite vocabulary. And I want to, I think, do the same today, but I want to broaden the picture out. I haven't seen any refutation of suggestions that we're going to have a general election before Christmas. The early commentary on the cabinet appointments, and there's another topic of conversation born of those cabinet appointments that is possibly something we'll discuss in the next hour. There's a kind of, can I use my words quite carefully, because I am obviously a middle-aged white man. There's a very engaging disagreement unfolding between prominent journalists of colour about whether or not the presence of people like Priti Patel and Sajid Javid in the cabinet is a blow for diversity and a blow for multiculturalism, or whether their politics eclipse their ethnicities. And as I say, as a middle-aged white bloke, I don't know. I'm not even sure my opinion should matter a jot, but I'm intrigued by the question, and it's one to which I may turn your attention after 11 o'clock. But as I say, there was no really robust refutation of the or rejection, actually, is a better word to use, of the suggestion that the cabinet, as it was being appointed, had very much the look of a cabinet in preparation for the general election. Towards the end of yesterday's programme, we achieved a sort of broad consensus about what we felt Boris Johnson's plan might be in the short term. And at the very top of that list of plans was a general election. Many people suggest September. I'm not actually sure what the arithmetic is on calling one. Does Parliament have to be sitting? I presume so, but once it's called, the wheels move incredibly quickly, and it means that before Christmas, and I know that with the thermometers shooting into the stratosphere yesterday, and to a lesser extent today, the idea that Christmas is in any way just around the corner seems particularly laughable. But it'll be upon us before we know it. It'll be September before you notice. The kids will be back at school, and then the next big break is Christmas. So before Christmas, we are going to have a general election, I think. And it is, barring something unforeseeable at the moment, it's going to be fought between Jeremy Corbyn and Boris Johnson, with very, very significant roles being played by the Brexit Party, as it calls itself, and the Liberal Democrats with their new leader in place, Jo Swinson, who has become herself something of a receptacle for warring factions this week. I know this is a desperately unfashionable thing to say in the context of politics. I don't really have a very strong opinion about Jo Swinson yet. I don't know enough about her, I haven't seen enough of her, and I am not familiar enough with her policy positions. Obviously, as a member of the coalition government, she would have voted for a lot of legislation that many people on the left of British politics are repulsed by. Actually, I presume that there's plenty of people on the right of British politics who are repulsed by some of the stuff that the coalition government did, because Boris Johnson gets cheered to the rafters every time he promises to undo such policies, chiefly this week, of course, with the reversal of Theresa May's cuts to the police service. But I don't have a strong opinion about Jo Swinson, a position that is very much at odds with the current climate. You're supposed to have a strong opinion about everything. I don't think anyone will be surprised to learn that I have quite strong opinions about Nigel Farage, but you can't argue with the arithmetic, and his so-called Brexit party is essentially the new UKIP, so they're hitting 15% plus now, even in some council elections. So it looks like it will be a four-party contest in a way that I don't think we've really seen in this country. There was a brief prospect of major change to the two-party system when the SDP emerged from the similar factionalism, the similar Labour conservative factionalism of the late 70s, early 80s. If you think about it, I think you can probably see some echoes or some reflections today of what happened then, when the gap between Michael Foot's Labour and Margaret Thatcher's Conservatives became so huge that many people felt there was a chasm in the middle, the centre ground, if you like. And into that chasm galloped David Owen and Shirley Williams and Roy Jenkins and Bill Rogers. And for a moment, it looked as if they might effect lasting and profound political change. It's a little bit glib, a little bit simplistic, but I think it holds some water to suggest that the invasion of the Falkland Islands by the Argentinians under General Galtieri put paid to that prospect. I think the polling had the SDP in first place until the Argentinian troops landed in Port Stanley, and it was that patriotic fervour drummed up by the Falklands conflict that gave Margaret Thatcher an incredible electoral fillip and arguably consigned the third party to traditional third-party status. But this one looks different, doesn't it? This one does look different. Four parties, almost all of which have been top of one poll or another in recent months, and all of which will be fighting the next general election. So, what do you think will happen? 0345 6060973. There are already movements on Facebook suggesting that Boris Johnson is employing a very sophisticated technological approach. People being invited to share their priorities with the Conservative Party and register all of their details and data, and many suggestions that in return these people will get very carefully tailored adverts popping up in their Facebook feed designed to persuade them on an almost bespoke individual level that Boris Johnson is the man for them. I also have to tell you that the failure of many people in what is sometimes referred to as the mainstream media to properly understand Jeremy Corbyn's appeal becomes pertinent again. Jeremy Corbyn, for all his myriad personal failings, and I appreciate that you may not even agree with that description, rightly or wrongly represents radical change. Now, oddly, don't laugh, so did Brexit. And oddly, don't laugh, they appeal in a similar fashion. The idea that things are so, look, this is just not right, this is just so rubbish, I'm going to vote for really meaningful change. That's how they sold Brexit. And even a most cursory understanding of radical British politics over the last 200 years leads inexorably to the conclusion that Jeremy Corbyn is the only candidate in generations who seems prepared or set to deliver it, to deliver really radical, meaningful change. And that would involve representation in a way that we haven't really seen in this country for a while. It would involve nationalisation. It would involve prioritisation of public services and amenities. It would probably involve public ownership of things that have passed over the last few decades into private hands. And I mention that because it highlights once again that 1983 flavoured gulf between the Conservative Party and the Labour Party, with this enormous gap in between. And I haven't even mentioned the Greens, who in most other European countries are absolutely rocking at the moment. A combination of tradition, the electoral system, and I think so-called legacy media, that's a new phrase I've heard this week, combine to create an environment in the United Kingdom into which the Greens are yet to inject massive political momentum. But I think they will in our lifetime. I think they will. So what's going to happen this year? Probably in September, almost certainly before Christmas. Tell me your feelings as well. How do you feel about the prospect of a general election? I don't think Brenda from Bristol will be echoing around the country. I think there probably is a sense that we need a bit of a dose of political salt. So we need to, reset. We turn it off and turn it on again and see what happens. And if Boris Johnson ends up with a majority that allows him to get stuff through Parliament, or if Jeremy Corbyn ends up in Downing Street, then you are going to see some fairly significant changes after 3 years of political stagnation, 3 years of genuine standstill. I said yesterday, and I still mean it, I might change my mind by the end of the show, but in 20 years' time, if you're asked who became Prime Minister after David Cameron, I don't think we'll say Theresa May without having a bit of a stop and a think, because it's like this 3-year fuzz, this 3-year blob of nothingness, 3 years of absolute stillness and stagnation. And it may be that we don't mention Boris Johnson either, because he could be out by Christmas. In which case, who became Prime Minister after David Cameron? Was it that Corbyn bloke? And I should stress again, an awful lot of people listening to this programme, particularly people of the Jewish faith or of a Jewish background, will find the prospect of a Jeremy Corbyn premiership quite chilling. Just putting it out there. It's a statement of fact. They will. Whether they should or not is, I suppose, debatable, but I'm not going to sit here and tell people to somehow abandon their own fears and feelings because some Herbert over there is telling them that they're ill-founded. So, what do we think about the prospect of a general election? 0345 606 0973. And crucially, and this is one of those lovely mornings where I say, give me a ring and say something clever. Crucially, what do you think will happen? Genuine question there. I would cautiously suggest this is going to be one of the hardest to call. Whatever the polls tell us, this is going to be the hardest general election to call in living memory. So call it for me, please. I'm not staking my reputation on this one, but I suspect it's quite strongly that there will be a general election sooner rather than later. I want to know how you feel about that. And secondly, what you think will happen. Not necessarily what you want to happen, because, as ever on the programme, the why is more interesting than the what. But what you think will happen. 20 minutes after 10 is the time. Danny is in Benfleet to kick things off. Danny, what would you like to say?
Morning, James.
Hello, mate.
I think I agree there'll be a general election sooner rather than later. I think Boris is quite cleverly put together a cabinet. I think he thinks that could win a general election. I think that's obvious now, isn't it? And he's going to be pandering. He's going to be going for people who voted for Brexit in 2016, and also in the European elections who voted for the Brexit Party. I think he knows he can take on Corbyn and it'll beat him.
That's definitely his calculation, and it's one I think you seem to agree with.
Yeah.
Why would anyone vote for Boris Johnson who didn't vote? And obviously, everyone knows this, but it's worth reminding ourselves that you don't vote for a Prime Minister. But I think an awful lot of us cast our vote for our constituency MP according to who is leading their party. Not all of us, but a lot of us. Why would anyone who didn't vote for Theresa May vote for Boris Johnson?
I think that it's got to a stage where the working classes now are so disillusioned with Labour, and let's have it right, it's the working classes that decide an election. They make up the majority of the electorate.
Well, again, I don't really know what that means, because Boris Johnson has offered tax cuts to people earning double the national average salary, and that's a kick in the teeth for what I would traditionally mean by the working classes. It's a massive boost to people in the southeast and pensioners, and actually, not to split hairs, but most general elections are decided by pensioners. That's why all political parties spend so much time introducing policies that please them. It's not decided by ordinary working people. Otherwise, we probably wouldn't have had a Conservative government since the war. Yeah, but
James, pensioners, the majority of pensioners were working class as well.
But again, I don't know what you mean by that, mate. You mean they had jobs?
Yeah, well, they.
Well, then we're all working class.
Well, not in the same respect, though, are they?
Well, what then?
The majority of pensioners nowadays would have worked jobs, they would have paid mortgages, they would have now drawn.
But that's everybody. But what do you mean by working class? I don't quite follow.
Well, okay. What do you mean? What do you think working class is then?
I don't know. I haven't got a clue. It's a phrase I try not to use, but if I hear someone else using it, I generally presume that they mean people at the lower end of the income scale. I don't presume they mean people earning more than double the national average, which are the only people that Boris Johnson has offered a financial fillip to at the moment. There's nothing to stop him coming out with other stuff. I'm sure he will, but it doesn't matter what I mean by it, because I'm not the one using it. What do you mean by it?
Well, to me, working class means someone that has worked hard pretty much most of their life. They haven't had the boost that some people have.
They haven't had the boost that some people have.
Well, they haven't had the fortune of being born into money, going to the best schools, walking into jobs just because you know someone.
Right.
And they've worked hard for that.
And they look at Boris Johnson and see a hero, do they? A man who went to Eton, was born into wealth, has had an incredibly leisurely career, fired from various different positions for various different transgressions, And you think, I'm not saying you're wrong, that what you call working class people see him as their champion, but under your definition of working class, it's hard to think of someone more at odds with what you've just said, except perhaps Jacob Rees-Mogg, who you probably quite like as well, do you?
Not really, if I'm being honest with you. But, James, I think what people forget is that the majority of working classes, they also make mistakes. They don't particularly care about Palestine. They don't...
and that Corbyn seems to. Well, I don't know about this because I think you're right. No, I think you're right. They don't care particularly, but I don't think many middle class people do either. I'm just a little bit uncomfortable with the distinction because I'm not quite sure what it means, and it sometimes I think is camouflage under which an awful lot of other stuff is smuggled. I don't think you're doing that, Danny, but I think if you look at what the Labour Party policy platform is, you'd have to be Harry Houdini to get out of the conclusion that it offers a hell of a lot more to what I would call ordinary working people than anything on the Conservative Party's manifesto would do.
The problem with the Labour Party is it's the people banging the drum for the Labour Party as well. I mean, you've got people that, like people like Momentum and groups like that, and there's no comparison with them in the working class whatsoever. But the Labour Party I'm
not going to steer you away from this working class phrase, am I? But the bottom line is that all the policies of nationalisation, welfare reform, house building, safeguarding the NHS, these are all things that are designed, specifically to favour what you would call working class interests over the interests of, for example, inherited wealth. But I completely get that it doesn't butter your parsnips because you look at the personnel involved and they leave you feeling very cold. But don't make the mistake of thinking that the personnel and the policies are the same. Labour Party policies are probably more conducive to protection of what you call the working class than any policy platform we've seen in 30 or 40 years. But because the people holding the reins of the Labour Party seem so unsympathetic and so unattractive, you're not getting to that. And I'm not surprised. But let's not use that phrase working class to describe a constituency that Boris Johnson's going to look after, mate. Come on.
Well, no, I mean... A constituency MP and Prime Minister are two totally different things. You were correct in what you were saying earlier, that most people will vote for their constituency MP based on what their party's doing. Yeah,
based on who the leader is. And my personal problem in my constituency is that I really like my constituency MP, who happens to be Labour, but I really don't like Jeremy Corbyn and what he represents.
There you go then, James.
Yeah, that's it.
You've hit the nail on the head. That's why people won't vote for Labour.
Because of Jeremy Corbyn, not because of the policies.
Yeah,
I'm not going to argue with that.
That's the naivety of voters. Yeah, that's the naivety of the electorate. But
although he did a hell of a lot better last time than anybody was expecting, and his supporters always argue that if he is afforded the space and time, I don't get this argument, but I'm sure someone will ring in and explain what I'm missing. If he gets the space and time that he is entitled to during an election period, then the magic musters and everyone can see what during non-election periods only the party faithful or the Corbyn faithful can see. I don't get that because, as I've said a few times, and it's not exclusive to this programme or this studio, he could go wherever he wanted, whenever he wanted, and have as much time on air as he pleased. He might have to answer a couple of uncomfortable questions about his past actions, but every politician does. And the print media in particular leans towards the right in this country, but the idea that Jeremy Corbyn somehow can't get to the platforms and the podiums he needs to get to during non-election periods is, to me, absurd. But you know, possibly there's evidence out there of Jeremy Corbyn taking the message to people who need to be converted as opposed to people who already are. I just haven't seen it yet myself. Cheers, Danny. I think that's going to become one of my new bugbears, that phrase working class, because it gets used a hell of a lot. Not having a pop at you, Danny. Just I am going to insist that people explain exactly what they mean by it, because if you've got a job and you work hard, it doesn't actually matter whether you're a merchant banker or a docker. Under most definitions that don't just look at income, you're going to be working class. I don't think many of us consider the average merchant banker to be working class. Jonathan's in Manchester. Jonathan, what would you like to say?
Hey, I've just a quick bit on sort of the Lib Dems. I'm a Lib Dem voter and member myself.
Yes.
And you were talking about there being sort of a four-party race potentially in the next election.
Yes.
And a lot of that comes off the momentum of the European elections, obviously.
Yes.
Sort of, in terms of it being a four-party race, I'm a little unsure.
Well,
because-
by a four-party race, I mean there's going to be four people in it, four parties in it. I don't suggest necessarily that there's much prospect of anyone except Labour or Conservatives coming out first.
Oh, yeah. No, I think we're talking in terms of sort of who are the major players rather than who's going to be the one with the most votes at the end. I think that it's entirely possible that sort of Boris Johnson becoming Prime Minister is the worst possible thing that could have happened for the Brexit Party.
Yes.
Because he's sort of the Leave vote guy other than Nigel Farage.
Yes, very much so.
And a lot of people who voted Brexit are going to actually go, we've got our guy in the Conservative Party.
And this is when it becomes fascinating about the chronology, because if the election is before October the 31st, I think that's win-win for Johnson, potentially, with the constituency you're describing. But if the election is after October the 31st and we haven't left, then it could backfire horribly.
Yeah. Oh, no, absolutely. Which sort of leads me on to what I wanted to say about the Lib Dems.
Yes.
Is I think the Lib Dems will do very, very, very well if the election is before October the 31st.
Right.
And we still haven't left the EU.
Because you think they will garner the Remain support. You see, Jeremy Corbyn's consortiums are pathetic, aren't they? I mean, do you know what is Labour a Remain party at the moment or not? Do you know?
Labour is, from what I can see, and there's very mixed messages because Labour has been sitting on the fence for, since the word go, it seems, pretty much. And that's sort of leads me on to why the Lib Dems have such an opportunity now, because they have an opportunity not just to see sort of the middle ground, with Johnson sort of having a quite far right, in colloquial terms, sort of cabinet.
Yes.
The Lib Dems can really seize the middle ground and quite a lot of the ground to the traditional left of centre.
Yes.
Like
centre right and centre left is up for grabs at the moment, I would argue, because you've got hard left and hard right in the upper echelons of both parties, and that, it's odd, isn't it? Monday feels like such a long time ago. It's almost like a week is a long time in politics. But when we were discussing the fascinating fact that Boris Johnson wooed Metropolitan Liberals to become London Mayor, this was before he appointed his cabinet. I don't think many people would call that cabinet Metropolitan Liberal. So they moved to the right. Labour remains further to the left than it has been for many years. And yet, still in the middle, there's, for Jonathan, there's the Lib Dems. Does that work for you? Here's an interesting tweet from Am Incorrigible. The thing I find most interesting about it is it doesn't actually contain any opinion, I don't think. And it could be construed in two completely different ways. And as such, it sums up a lot of where British politics is at the moment. I think it does anyway. Here it is. People didn't know who Corbyn was in 2017, but they do now. So presumably some people will go, exactly, and that's why he'll win. And other people go, exactly, and that's why he'll lose. Do you see what I mean about that being quite a nice little distillation of bigger truths? 10:35 is the time. If you're just joining us, you can probably gather what we're talking about. I want to know what you think about the prospect of a general election. I can't quite see how there won't be one. I kind of feel there has to be one before Christmas. Most of the analysis at the moment agrees. And then what do you think would happen in it? Because I do think it's harder to call than any other election I can remember. And there have been surprises, there have been shocks in the course of my lifetime. When Kinnock lost, that certainly after a very triumphalist rally at which he behaved as if he'd already won, that counted as a shock. Cameron got an overall majority in 2015. That was, you remember that? It was when we voted for David Cameron instead of Chaos with Ed Miliband. That was a close one, wasn't it? Imagine how awful it would have been if we'd voted for Chaos with Ed Miliband. We might have sort of spent 3 years doing absolutely nothing, made a mockery of ourselves in the eyes of the world, and still not got any idea of what the future's going to look like. So thank God we avoided that. But that was a shock. No one was more shocked, actually, than David Cameron. But this one really is a funny one, because you can't rule out the so-called Brexit Party and the Liberal Democrats doing something that hasn't been seen before in domestic politics, and sort of just threatening that two-party stranglehold. 10:36 is the time. I think Boris Johnson's appointment as Prime Minister and his appointments in his cabinet bad news for the so-called Brexit Party, because these are people who are attractive to the kind of people that are attracted to the Brexit Party. You know, you kind of gung-ho, sabre-rattling ignoramuses. That's what they like, and their vote counts the same as everybody else's. But what do you think? Will it work? Will it wash? Matt's in Lewisham. Matt, what would you like to say?
Hi, James. Before I start, I hesitated because you said you wanted intelligent contributions, and I hesitated before I dialed, but here goes.
The worst... And what is it? The best are full of doubt, the worst are full of passionate intensity. By dint of doubting your intelligence, Matt, you qualify as clever. Carry on.
Well, I put all of this within the context that all principles have gone out the window.
They seem to have done, yes.
All idea of what's good for the country has gone out the window, but I have a feeling that he will run an election, and yes, he will hoover up and secure a big enough majority. Now, what he does with that majority, I don't know. But I think he has...
Why do you think that? Because
he has to play a matrix here.
Come on.
So, first of all, the first act is to out-Brexit the Brexit Party, which I think he is looking like he is doing.
But that doesn't win. What votes does that win from 2017? I understand the votes it wins from a notional 2019 election, but who is going to vote for Johnson that didn't vote for May in 2017?
Because in 2017, the shriek of betrayal was already being heard in constituencies. So he can, if he gets his timing right, he can run an election before people like Steve Baker are screaming betrayal.
Brexit hard man, Steve Baker.
He can still bluff and bluster and lie to the electorate to say that he's going to do this. So I think he can take those Brexit votes. I think also, and this is, Corbyn, I'm not a fan of Corbyn, but he is in a very difficult position that his top 30 Leave constituencies are Labour and the top 30 Remain are Labour.
Is that right?
But I think Boris, let's call him by his proper name, Mr. Johnson, will be able to take those Leave, enough of those Leave voters from Corbyn, and he will be able to do it all before A, the right can scream betrayal, and B, I think before sanity will prevail and he will unravel as a human being and as a politician. And if he gets his timing right, and
he's got 5 years to do with what he wants.
And what he does with it, I have no idea.
No.
And that's for another...
The only thing you can say with certainty is that nothing is certain. I know that sounds a little bit glib. I'll go a tiny bit further. The only thing you can say with certainty is that he will not hesitate to completely abandon previously held positions if he thinks it would help him today to abandon what he swore blind he would do yesterday. We know that. That's not a criticism. I think everyone knows that about him.
And for him now, it's just about timing.
Yes.
Before it unravels, and before it unravels in the sanity prevails, before it unravels into the far right.
And then throw in a little side order of there won't be any movement on the so-called withdrawal agreement, but we'll blame that on the European Union and hope people are credulous enough to fall for it. And when you look at what they've fallen for over the last 3.5 to 4 years, you could see why Johnson might be quite optimistic about the prospect of people falling for a doubling down on the con, a doubling down on the scapegoating and blaming.
Yeah, and throw in a number of uncosted spending pledges, which are quite easy to chuck out, like the 20,000 police officers.
And don't mention that you're simply undoing policy decisions that were taken by governments that you were part of, for most of his cabinet, and for him in part as well, although he wasn't, of course, a national politician for much of the coalition, well, for all of the coalition governments. Tenure. It is 10:41. You are listening to James O'Brien. I like that from Matt. That line from Yeats has been resonating with me a lot. I probably slightly misremembered it, but the idea about passionate intensity for people who don't know anything, have the strongest held opinions, and the best are full of doubt, or the best lack all conviction, I think is the phrase. And it's slightly self-serving, obviously, but that idea that, not brooking the possibility that you could be wrong, that's the kind of attitude that lends itself to the sort of sloganeering and empty sound bites that we've seen so much of in the last few years, culminating now in a new golden age, or you've got to be more optimistic. That's pretty much the polar opposite of what a detailed policy looks like. What if optimism? Okay, yeah, I'll vote for that. Tom's in Letchworth. Tom, what would you like to say?
Well, I welcome the prospect of a general election as a Labour member. But I really think that Boris's strategy for a general election depends on what happens on the 1st of August in Brecon and Radnorshire.
Do you?
Yeah, I mean, obviously the Conservative candidate there is the same candidate who was mired in the scandal that.
So he's hobbled, isn't he? He's hobbled, isn't he?
Yeah, and the Conservatives are due. Well, looking at the polling from last week, they're due to lose it to the Liberal Democrats by quite a lot.
Right.
But how much does the Conservative vote fold, and how much does the Brexit Party gain from that? I think if
But no, I'm going to just briefly disagree with you before you carry on, because you've explained in a way why this is a unique by-election and therefore not necessarily a gauge by which we'd be able to judge bigger pictures. You've got a candidate standing who he's hobbled from before the starting line. That's the problem. So even if the Brexit Party destroy the Conservative vote in Brecon and Radnorshire, it wouldn't have that many lessons for what might happen on a national scale, would it?
Well, I'm not entirely sure, for the reasons that the caller before stated, that the Brexit Party will decimate the Conservatives.
No.
Obviously, Plaid and the Renew Party and the Greens have all stood down to allow their voters.
That's an interesting precedent that could have implications on the national stage, more so than the results. That decision to coalesce around a single candidate for Remain-leaning parties is fascinating.
Yeah, I think it is. But I do think that if that Conservative vote doesn't fall as much as Boris Johnson thinks it will, then surely that's a good sign for the Conservatives. The other thing I quite like to say about that your previous caller mentioned was about Boris Johnson hoovering up Leave constituencies, and I'm not sure that, especially in the north, that will happen. I lived in the, although I'm in Letchworth, I lived in the north for 4 years, in the northwest in Manchester.
Yes.
People up there still remember, back to Margaret Thatcher and the wrecking of the north that she did. Now, if they may well for the Brexit Party, but if you look at we're talking about another by-election. But if you look at Peterborough, Labour were able to get out their activists into the city and, against all odds, hold Peterborough against the Brexit Party. I think if Labour can do that in the northeast and hold the northeast against the Brexit Party, then Boris Johnson hoovering up Brexit
is not a foregone conclusion at all. It's all about Brexit still, though, isn't it? Even I'm getting a bit dispirited by that. I wish we could be talking about other things that matter, but the next general election, every caller so far seems to think is going to be fought upon that battlefield once again, and it's hard to quibble. Why are you looking forward to it as a Labour member, and would you be looking forward to it even more if you had a different leader?
No, I think Jeremy Corbyn got stuck between a rock and a hard place. You've got Labour Leave constituencies, and you've got Labour Remain constituencies, and for the longest time he's all this, Labour sitting on the fence, Labour's not choosing a side, because Labour is more than. It is more than Brexit.
I admire your loyalty. I hope you get a lollipop for it. I'm sorry to patronise you.
Well, maybe, but I think
But he's a flipping leader, mate. He's supposed to lead. He's supposed to have a position. He's supposed to explain it, defend it, propound it, promote it, sell it, and win on the back of it. But because he doesn't actually believe in much, except, apple pie and sunshine, it's very, very hard for people to feel inspired by him, particularly people who consider that leaving the European Union is going to be a very silly thing to do. He hasn't spoken to a single one of them.
What about the positions that you mentioned about Labour's policies earlier?
Imagine that vehicle with a decent driver, Tom. It's a beautiful vehicle. It's a beautiful, beautiful vehicle, politically speaking, for someone like me. I think the policy platform is inspiring. Jeremy Corbyn, however, to put it very, very mildly, is not. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. I don't know why. I've mentioned this a few times. I'll mention it again. There's always a shortage of female voices when we start chopping up chickens and examining the entrails in the hope of making meaningful and accurate political predictions. And I don't know why. I was chatting about this yesterday with someone in a position of power, and there is a reluctance. Men don't need much encouragement because we all think we're fascinating. Women, this is an appalling generalisation, but it holds largely true. You just don't have that same level of, is confidence the right word? Sounds a bit kind to men. I guess it plays again a bit into that Yeats quote that is haunting me at the moment. The best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. The best being the female of the species in this context, and the worst being us blokes. 10:51 is the time. What do you think about an election? What do you think will happen in it? Sam's in Chichester. Sam, what would you like to say?
Okay, so I think the election all depends on October the 31st and whether we leave.
It's going to be before October. It's going to be before October the 31st.
I thought it was October the 31st.
No, I think the election's going to be before October the 31st.
Okay.
That's my theory. That's my view, anyway.
So, if the election is before Brexit, then it will be a case of, in my opinion, the Conservative and Brexit Party absolutely cleaning up by appealing. Because, okay, as someone who joined the Labour Party to vote in Jeremy Corbyn as leader, because I agree with his politics generally, the left is not as good at spinning a line as the right is. And the right, all you have to do is look at Trump in America and how much people got behind the patrioticness of Make America Great Again.
Yes.
That was a brilliant slogan.
It kind of was in demagoguery terms, but he did lose, he lost the popular vote. And the only reason I paused and interrupted you is because of what you were intimating about the scale of this potential victory. I mean, Trump won. There's absolutely no point pretending otherwise. You'd be truly ridiculous to do so. But it was far from a landslide. He got millions fewer votes than Hillary Clinton. So I don't know that you can cite that as a precedent for Johnson securing an epic victory, which is what I think you were kind of hinting at.
Well, you have similar situations here where if you look at densely populated areas by London, like London, they voted Remain overwhelmingly. And you go to rural areas and they voted to leave overwhelmingly, from my understanding of how people voted in the Brexit referendum.
Yes.
That's very similar to in America, how the rural working class in America voted for Trump and densely populated. And because of the way the electoral college works in America, different areas are weighted differently. It's not dissimilar to how it is in England.
I'll let that stand. I mean, it's probably worthy of a little bit more scrutiny, but we'll let that stand. And that leads me to the next question, which is why, if it happens before October the 31st, this notional voter here, who in 2017 could either vote for Jeremy Corbyn or Theresa May, both of whom at the time were pledging to continue with Brexit, why would anybody who didn't vote for Theresa May back then vote for Boris Johnson now? And if you say charisma, I shall kill you.
I'm not going to say charisma, because I don't think
actually, charisma is probably a valid answer, so I withdraw that death threat.
Personality. If I can't say charisma, I'll say personality.
Yeah, so you're talking about voters that stayed at home last time?
Yeah. I don't think,
that's interesting.
I don't think Jeremy Corbyn, if you agree with Jeremy Corbyn, he inspires you to turn out for the vote. No,
that's not true. I agree with Jeremy Corbyn about lots of things, but I find him ridiculous and pathetic, so very hard to vote for.
Given a choice between Boris Johnson
I'm not answering that question yet. I'm not answering that question yet.
Okay, so that's well, that's my opinion.
I don't, it's like being offered the choice between a hair sandwich or a poo in a cone.
It's very Lib Dem. Like, I changed my vote last time I voted Lib Dem. I like what I've seen of the current Lib Dem leader. We've had. Do
you? If I used the word shrill, would that be sexist?
What do you mean?
I just found her quite shrill from what I've seen of her this week in her interviews, and that might be mildly sexist, but don't forget one of the very first things Margaret Thatcher did after becoming leader of the Conservative Party was undergo a crash course in voice modulation that brought her register down by about 2 octaves. I don't know if that makes me a bad person, but I'm just being honest with you, Sam.
If that's how you find her, but that doesn't bother me.
It will do, though, because you're talking about the election being a beauty contest. You're talking about charisma and charm and personality. Then I'm afraid these factors do become pertinent, reluctant though I am to bring them to the table.
Which is why the left's going to lose.
Which is why the left might lose. Although I that question there, Johnson or Corbyn, a pal of mine who's quite a highfalutin journalist, was with him at the weekend, and we were at dinner, and we've never ever argued about politics. It's quite funny. Generally doesn't come up with friends, particularly my friends on the Mail, but he wouldn't let it lie. He wouldn't let it lie. I think we were into the second bottle of Chianti. Go on then. Johnson or Corbyn? And everyone who says Johnson or Corbyn, they think it's a rhetorical question. Everyone who says, go on, Johnson or Corbyn, think it's obvious that it should be Johnson or obvious that it should be Corbyn. And that completely misses the existence of me and millions like me who, it's really hard. Not probably that hard, especially if you're lucky enough to have a good constituency MP. But still, most people probably can't name their constituency MP super quickly, but they can certainly name the two main party leaders. And those are the names that they'll be carrying into the voting booth. Have you seen this stuff about the Fortnite World Cup? Yeah, there's a lot of stuff I predict doesn't come true. It doesn't come right, and I don't write the headlines on the viral clips for the record. Sometimes I think that the lad who does write them is deliberately trolling a section of the LBC audience by portraying me as some sort of all-seeing messiah. But I did say, and I wish I'd kept this, about, Christ, so long since I used to do those gigs, so it must be 15 years ago. And I was doing one of those interminable paper reviews, I think on Sky News. And I said, in quite soon, people will be getting paid fortunes to play video games, and they will be a spectator sport, right? And everybody laughed. The other panellists laughed. The presenter laughed. I presume most of the audience laughed. It was before Twitter, so I didn't get bombarded with abuse and cajoling on social media, but I just meant it. Because I played a lot of video games back in the day, BC, and the prize in a tournament being played at Flushing Meadows in New York, the home of the United States Tennis Open, the prize for the winner of the Fortnite World Cup is... I'll tell you in the next hour. You won't believe me when I tell you, but the ticketing is sold out, and the prize... Well, I'll tell you now, it's probably not too late to retrain as a professional video games player if you're under 30. Most of the lads in the frame to win it are in their teens, but when I tell you what the top prize is, you will splutter into your muesli. Julie's in Falkirk. Julie, election, what do you reckon?
Hi, I was just saying to your colleague, I don't really know what's going to happen, but I think one of two things will. I think if the election is before October 31st, there's a chance that the Remain vote coalesces around the Lib Dems, which is a member of the Lib Dems I think is quite exciting.
Well, tell me why I shouldn't vote for my Labour MP who I know and like.
Well, I think living in Scotland, I think I've been tactical voting for the last 6 or 7 years, and I think whether you should vote for your Labour MP or not depends very much on what's going on in your constituency. And I really don't know what is.
Oh, fair enough. What a great answer. That's got me. I'll shut up now and let you speak.
But I think there will be a lot of tactical voting going on in the next general election. And I think that we've been seeing that in Scotland for a while now.
And you, as a Liberal Democrat member, would hope and with some reason expect a sort of coalescing around your candidates in an election that is probably going to be fought once again upon the battleground of Brexit. But more positive, I think, for Johnson than for anybody else. Just emerged in the course of that hour, which was interesting.